So today we're going to talk about Baltasar and Blemunda, which is an amazing novel written by the Portuguese writer José Saramago. Baltasar and Blemunda was first published in Portuguese as Memorial do Convento in 1982, and it is a love story set in the 18th century with the construction of the convent of Mafra near Lisbon as its background. But before I go into this fascinating novel, I would like to talk about its author, the equally fascinating José Saramago. Now, José Saramago was born in 1922 in a village called Azinhaga in Portugal. His family were landless peasants, so we're talking dirt poor here. 2 years after his birth, in 1924, the whole family moved to Lisbon, where his father worked as a policeman. Although Saramago grew up in Lisbon, he spent vacations in the little village he had been born. Now, let's talk about a few remarkable facts about Saramago's life. Fact number one, he went to a technical school from the age of 12 and worked as a car mechanic as soon as he graduated. Fact number two, he didn't attend college. Fact number three, he became a great reader thanks to his frequent visits to public libraries. Now, let's talk about him as a writer, which I think is a lot more interesting than talking about his life. Now, Saramago's first published book is from the 1940s, but he practically didn't write fiction or poetry again until the 1970s, right? So he gradually became the writer that now thousands of people around the world know today, probably in the 80s and the 90s, right? Saramago wrote all his work in Portuguese, but his books are widely available in English translation. You will not struggle to find them in really good translations. Now, although he was celebrated in Portugal first and in Spain, Brazil, and Spanish America later, he became a world-famous writer when he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1998. This is remarkable. He is not only the only Portuguese writer to have been awarded the Nobel Prize, but also he's the only Portuguese language writer to have it to this day. Now, Saramago wrote fiction, poetry, essay, plays, memoirs. He was also a literary critic and a journalist and went through different phases in his writing in terms of style. Now, people who have read his whole oeuvre, or at least books from different periods, say that you can see an evolution and a development in his writing over time. Another fascinating thing, Saramago was 60 years old when he published Baltasar and Blemunda, which was only his fourth novel, right? So fourth novel at the age of 60. Before that, he had mostly written poetry and non-fiction. Now, Baltasar and Blemunda is an important novel for many reasons, and one of them is that it is the first book that earned Saramago critical acclaim, and it wasn't just a flash in the pan. Saramago followed it up with many great novels, including my very own favorite, The Year of the Death of Ricardo Reis. Now, a fundamental question here is, why did it take Saramago so long to attain the status of a critically acclaimed writer, and why are there some noticeable gaps in his early literary production, right? He wrote in the 1940s and didn't publish again until the 70s. And to answer those questions, we need to look at the historical background, right? Portugal was a fascist dictatorship between 1933 until 1974, when the Carnation Revolution took place in April of that year. Now, first, the country was ruled by António de Oliveira Salazar until his death in 1968, and then by Marcelo Caetano until the April Revolution of 1974. As you can imagine, the right-wing dictatorship is, or living in a right-wing dictatorship is not the most conducive background for an artist, particularly one with a poor background and no connections whatsoever. So that long gap between his first book, Saramago's first book in the 1940s, and his writing in the 1970s, I interpret that as a period when Saramago experimented and learned the craft of writing. Now, remember that he had no academic education whatsoever. right? So he had to train himself as a writer. Now let's talk about Balthazar and Blimunda, which is a historical novel, but also a lot more than that. Now the first thing about the novel that I want to say is that you don't need to be an expert on 18th century Portuguese history to read it. In fact, you don't need to know the next thing about it to enjoy this novel and make the most of it. Having said that, you might want to find out more about the time period after reading the book. It's so good that it would probably make you want to find out more later. Now, the main reason that you don't need to be an expert on Portuguese history, is because Saramago focuses on the story of two poor people. The kind of people who are never even mentioned in history books, at least not as individuals. Anyway, but let me give you a very general historical perspective anyway. So, in the 18th century, the form of government in Portugal was an absolutist monarchy. That meant that the king had all powers. Now, that was no different to most other European nations at the time, right? Now, for most of the 17th century, so the previous century, Portugal had been ruled by the kings of Spain. And only after a war that began in 1640 and ended in 1668 did Portugal regain its independence. Now, Portugal and the Portuguese Empire, which then occupied most of South America because it included Brazil. Now, that whole empire and the whole country had to be rebuilt after the war with Spain. But the tons of gold that were extracted from Brazil gave Portugal and its empire a second wind, as it were, during the 18th century. Now, after the decades of Spanish domination on Portugal and the struggle to regain independence, the Braganza dynasty had lots of money finally, and they knew how to spend it, right? And so it was then that King John V decided to build the amazing royal palace convent of Mafra near Lisbon, which is breathtaking. Now, if you're more familiar with French history, you can think of John V as the Portuguese version of Louis XIV, right? Now, the convent of Mafra was also, in a way, a response to the convent of El Escorial convent in Spain, built under Philip II of Spain, who had been the first Spanish monarch to rule Portugal. Mafra wasn't just meant to be a convent either, it was also meant to be a center of imperial government. Now, because the building complex is so huge, there were needed thousands of workers to build it, and it cost a lot of money. In a way, Balthazar and Blimunda, the novel, is a critique of the construction of the convent of Mafra, but it's more than that. The convent in the novel symbolizes the all-monarchic regime and the excesses of absolutist monarchies. There is also, of course, the story about the real motivation behind John V's desire to build the palace convent in the first place. Now, in the novel, the king makes a pact, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. I don't know how much of it is fact or myth anyway. So what I do know is that it makes for a great starting point for a novel. Now, another historical fact that is important to know about is the first flying machine that was created by a Brazilian priest called Bartolomeu de Guzmão, around the time the novel takes place, so also in the 18th century, and that features in the novel. So we have on the one hand the building of Mafra, the convent, the palace convent, and on the other hand an airship created by a priest known as the Pastola. Now, if you want to know how these two historical facts are connected in the novel, you'll just have to read it. I'm not going to sit here and spoil it for you. Of course I am not. Now, let's talk about the characters. The main two characters in the novel are Blimunda, who's a young woman with a supernatural ability. Her supernatural ability is that she can see what is inside a person. And I'm not talking about the soul or anything like that. She can literally see what is inside a person's body. She can see their organs, their bones, their lunch. The other main character in the novel is Balthazar, a young man who works both in the construction of Mafra and on that of the Pastola, the flying machine. Okay, so you can see a connection there, but there's more to it. Balthazar and Blimunda is also the love story between these two characters, of course. Now, one of the most fascinating aspects of this novel is all the historical research that Saramago had to undertake to write it, and how he's able to incorporate all of it, all his research, in the novel. For instance, I've read that the character of Blimunda was based on a real person from that time, and that real person was documented by the Portuguese Inquisition. Also, everything to do with the airship that Father Bartolomeo de Guzmán created, and all the other historical details are the fruit of Saramago's historical research. Now, if you want to start with Saramago, I recommend Balthazar and Blimunda, or The Year of the Death of Ricardo Reis, which is also a historical novel, but one that is set in the 1930s. I think both are his best, possibly his best novels, and he has many great novels. But of course, this is just my opinion. Now I'd love to hear from you in the comment section below. And if you're new to my channel, welcome. My name is Juan, and I post a new book review every Saturday. The best way not to miss any of my reviews would be for you to subscribe to my channel and turn on the notifications bell. This is all from me for now. I hope that you are all doing extremely well, and I hope to see you again very soon for another book review. Bye for now.